to our most recent technology. And it used to be that the brain was associated with a photo album, and then it became associated with a tape, and most recently, of course, with the board's microchip. In other words, the brain is often then simply referred back to the most recent of technologies. And this is interesting because now the technologies are moving ahead, and the question is, will the brain move along with them? Because you see, I say that inasmuch as many of the modern analogies to do with the brain, yes, with the computer and the chip and the board and so on, you may often hear this phrase that the brain, by virtue of this analogy, is thought of as being hardwired. Hardwired. Now, to be clear about that, what does it mean for something, a board or something else, to be hardwired? As you may know, hardwired means some kind of direct circuit. That is to say, a circuit that is either soldered or set or fixed. That's what makes it hard. However, as we now develop much more sophisticated instruments to measure and record and describe, even picture to some degree, what's going on in the brain, we find that this analogy of wiring is no longer holding up. What we begin to discover about the brain defies almost that analogy. That's a way of saying that we need new analogies, new pictures, new ways of thinking about this organ to keep up with the modern research that we now discover about its operations. So the work of this evening is to try and develop a bit that kind of thinking, that kind of new picturing about analogies that perhaps more accurately reflect the new research about the brain. Now, as a beginning here, I thought it might be helpful just to take a moment to see if we can get a slightly clearer picture about this organ. And to do that, I'd like to ask essentially three questions. They are different questions, sometimes they're thrown together, and I'd like to distinguish them if we can. The first, and these are all very simple questions, the first question will be is, how does the brain grow? How does the brain grow? This will have something to do with the structure of the brain. Second question is, how does the brain function? This has less to do with the structure of the brain, has more to do then with the activity of the brain. And finally, at the end, I'd like to say just a few words about the implications of these pictures in terms of education. That is to say, if we begin to develop new ideas about the structure and more especially about the functioning of the brain, what are the implications of those ideas for the way in which we teach and learn? These are questions, therefore, not so much of structure or function. These are then questions of pedagogy. So, with those three, we'll see how far we go. One guideline as we start. I am not much of a fan of going on and on and on and on and hoping people stay in there and hang in there with questions at the end. I'd be much happier if you can put these questions in as we go, because you see, as you may have heard, I am by profession a high school teacher. And that means that I'm used to being interrupted. But if I don't get interrupted, because I teach my lessons a lot, I'm in the habit of speaking in sentences that last about 90 minutes. So you should feel free to pump in and punch in as we go with comments and questions so that there's a bit more breath in the room than simply my own. So with those three guidelines and also these three questions, I'd like now to see where we start. Now, to begin with this question about how the brain grows, I'm very much indebted to the work of a neurobiologist or neuroscientist by the name of Reggie Melrose, who wrote a very helpful article in a very simple way. It's making very simple statements, I think 5 of them, about how the brain grows. I want to take each of them in turn, recognizing I'll try and put the question, begin to respond, and then hold back a little bit more until we get to the second part of the evening. But to begin, how does the brain grow? The first response is very, very simple. The brain grows by growing cells. But, as I mentioned to the high school faculty this afternoon, when you speak about any organ, not just the brain, growing and growing cells, we have to remember that this process of the growth of cells is always and only by a process of division, not of addition. You do not add a single cell to your body. Only by a process of a cell divided can we speak of growth. And this is true of the brain no less than any other organ. It grows by division, a process that starts in the single fertilized cell and then progressively differentiates by this process. And in so doing, you have to recognize then that in a certain sense, the original cell contains it all. Nothing is added from the outside in. It's all there from the inside out, from the beginning. Therefore, when I speak of the growth of the brain, this is intended to be a picture of progressive differentiation and division, not of accretion or addition. And that's an important detail, because when I now layer out a little bit something of the growth, we have to recognize that even if there are layers and developments and phases of the brain, all those three phases are there from the beginning. They're simply not differentiated out until when? We'll come to that. So, with this notion of the brain growing by growing cells by this process of progressive division and differentiation, we can then speak of three phases. First, the brainstem, including the amygdala. Second, the limbic system. And finally, then, the cortex with the neocortex as part of that third phase. And these three phases unfolded in a certain order, even though all three of them are there from the very beginning. It is said, in fact, that by the age of about 5, your brain is, in terms of size and volume, about 95% done. Not in function, but in structure, in growth. Most of it is there by the time you are 5. However, we've recently discovered, through some of the more sophisticated ways of measuring this kind of growth, that what we thought was a process that was done by the age of 5 or 6 or possibly 7 is not done at all. That this growth, this division, this progressive differentiation goes on in the limbic system well into the age of 10, 11, and 12. And as far as the third phase, the cortex and neocortex, the upper levels in that sense of the brain, they continue their process of differentiation into the 20s. There is one industry that has known this all along. The car insurance industry has known this all along. They knew there's something not yet fully developed in someone 21, 22, 23, and therefore you can't rent a car, at least not where I come from, in the United States, until you are over 23 and possibly 25. They give themselves 2 years of cushion just in case you're slow developing. But apart from that, we've sometimes assumed that the brain was kind of done many, many years earlier. Now, with more sophisticated measurements, we find this is not the case at all. There is, of course, therefore, good news, in the sense that you don't come with a fully formed brain. This will happen over as many as 2.5 decades. Now, going the other way, it is said that this brain, in its structural growth, peaks in the mid-20s or possibly late 20s, and after that it's, from a certain point of view, from the structural point of view, all downhill. Meaning that by the time you are 75, the volume and size of your brain is about the same as a 3-year-old. That might make sense of some behaviors of old people, but apart from that, it simply is a way of saying that this structure that has gone through a dividing growth also then goes through a progressive shrinkage. But we shouldn't therefore assume that growth represents intelligence or that shrinkage represents stupidity, because we do have, after all, very many wise grandparents in our midst, maybe some tonight here also. Anyway, just to speak about the growth in terms of expanding and then also continuing while it matures to contract. Now, beyond that, one last thing to say about this business of the growth before we get to the next question, the question of growth of the brain. There are certain features or portions of the brain that are more or less, responsive to different hormones. In the case of the hippocampus, which you know is towards the back of the brain, that portion of the brain in its growth is sensitive to estrogens, that is to say, the female hormones. And so in the case of the hippocampus, they grow longer in women than men. You may also know that it is in the hippocampus that we can chart some activities having to do with memory. For those of you who are married to one, You may know the implications of having a partner who has a much better memory than you do, and can sometimes hang on to details long beyond the time you forgot that they existed. That may be familiar to you. Or if you're not married yet, it may have come. By comparison, the men have also a portion of their brain that is more susceptible to the influence of androgens, that is the male hormone. And this is more in the amygdala, down here in the brainstem. And you may know that in the brainstem, here we have activities that have more to do with, and I use my language carefully here, activities have more to do with questions of anger and fear. Not to say that they are more one or the other, but just to say in terms of the female brain, there is this sympathy towards the memory centers. In the male brain, a certain sympathy towards the centers connected with anger and fear. That's a way of saying that the brains as they develop of males and females are not exactly the same, not just in terms of size, but in terms of relative weighting of the different portions of this mysterious organ. So that's the very first simple statement of Reggie Melrose in terms of how the brain grows. Simply growth of cells, understanding this divisive nature of cell growth. Now a second statement she makes, and again this one I have to utter very carefully because she has embedded in it an idea that I think deserves a bit more attention. She says, using these cells as they divide, one can speak of neural pathways being laid down by means of these cells. Neural pathways get laid down. The question remains, though, how this happens. How do these pathways, was mentioned earlier, how do these pathways get laid down? And that I'm going to defer as a question for the moment to the next set of issues. Hang on to that for a question for the moment. This question of neural pathways is going to be very important this evening. But to finish out with Reggie Melrose's various statements about how the brain grows, she goes on to say that if these pathways are used, then they develop around themselves certain fatty sheaths called myelin sheaths. And if for some reason these neural pathways do not get continuously used, then these pathways will not be myelinated, and if they do not create around themselves this sheath of myelin, they will eventually disappear, or simply melt away, you might say. Quite apart from that, however, next point, Reggie Melrose goes on to say that regardless of what you use or don't use, there is a time in the child's development, it comes remarkably early, where many of these neural pathways that have been laid down by whatever means we'll come to in a moment, many of these pathways have to be pruned. So quite apart from not using them and losing them, there is this other question that this pruning has to happen for the brain to be fully functional as a brain. In this regard, there's been some interesting research done, which I'll come to later on this evening. But to summarize a bit now what Reggie Melrose is developing here, she's developing a picture of the growth, not the function, but of the growth of the brain as very, very hierarchic, meaning that the neocortex will develop and grow only in the light of the successful growth of the limbic system, and the limbic system will grow only in the light of the successful growing of the amygdala of the brainstem. And if the first is in some way inhibited, the second has a hard time growing, and ditto, if the second is inhibited, the third, or neocortex or cortical lobes, will have a hard time growing as well. In that sense, there is a hierarchy of what comes first. When I move, though, to the next part, looking not so much at the growth and the structure, but looking more now to the questions of the function or the activity of the brain, the story is here quite different. First, I want to commend the work of these brain researchers who now, with the help of PET scans and fMRIs, these very highly sophisticated ways of measuring activity in or around the brain, by means of that, we have now access to a much more sophisticated understanding of what's happening there. However, it is important to remember that in these measurements, we are looking at the activity of the brain indirectly. We are not actually measuring what's going on in the brain. What we're doing is we're measuring what's happening around these activities. More precisely, if you focus on something and use your brain for a certain kind of activity, blood is drawn to that part of the brain, and that's what we're measuring. It is an indirect measurement that we're working with so far. I'll come back to that with a slide later this evening. But with that little proviso, I want to move now to say, well, what can we say about the nature of this functioning of the brain that's different simply from the structure? Here I have to go back now to the comment that Reggie Melrose makes about the neural pathways being laid down. And I posed the question a few minutes ago, how does that happen? It used to be thought that basically you were handed the pathways. You came that way. Or soon after you were born, within a matter of years, they were kind of there. And now, with this more sophisticated way of measuring activities in the structure of the brain, we begin to discover that these neural pathways are not handed to you, but they are laid down according to the experiences that you have. This is relatively new, because it really begins to challenge the more classical ways of talking about the brain, inasmuch as the experiences you have are not determined. They are had. You can to some degree even opt for this kind of experience or that kind of experience. And according to the kind of experience you have in nature or without nature, positive or not so positive, fraught with emotions or not fraught with emotions, creative or not, according to the experiences that you have, these neural pathways will form one way or form a quite different way. On the one hand, this is freeing as an idea. On the other hand, it's quite a scary thought. The experiences you have give rise to the brain that you get. If we follow this idea, however, I'll come to you. If we follow this idea, it does, I think, begin to challenge this notion so commonly still held of the brain being hardwired. Because if the brain, or the neural pathways in the brain, are being shaped according to the experiences you have, this is not a hardwiring. This is something else. And we need new images in order to capture this insight into the brain. Yes?
Just wondering about the experiences affect how the pathways in the brain. But also my friend and I may experience the same thing, but it might not be interpreted the same way, or so how does that play in, and do we have any research on that as far as the external can be different from the internal?
We sure do, and I will come to that later this evening, and it has in particular a relationship to do with stress. That is, you can have the same experience or be exposed to the same scene, but according to the stress level you bring to bear on that same scene, it will have immense differences according to this development of the neural pathways. I will come back to that. Again, feel free to pipe in as we go here. But now back to this question of looking for new models to make sense of this notion of neural pathways being laid down in the brain. Well, as you heard, I come from New England, or from Massachusetts, and we are, of course, enjoying, as you are here, the glories of the autumn. That means that we have trees and we have leaves falling in the forest and so forth. And my wife, who is very keen on gardening and also very keen on being a grandmother, as we now are grandparents to a new set of twins, now in their 5th year, we decided we'd better get our garden ready for the first visit of our granddaughters. The first visit in which they would come to stay with us without their parents spending the night. A big deal. So we had to get the garden ready. And to do that then, we decided to clear out a lot of the forest and get rid of all of the leaves there so the children could have a safe time playing without stumbling across this or that in the fallen leaves. So it was that we cleared the forest, and in doing so I had to cart bag and bag and bag after bag of these fallen leaves out to the pit where these leaves can be deposited. And to do that, I had to trudge my way through the rough leaves of this early autumn. In doing so, of course, I noticed that with every pathway, or every time I walked, a certain kind of path began to form. And as the American poet Robert Frost says, you can tread them black if you tread these leaves often enough. And in doing so, of course, quite naturally, out of this free forest, various pathways began to be laid down by my feet walking to the pit. And of course, had I chosen different pathways, the pathways wouldn't be so deep. And if I chose the same pathways, well, of course, they would be a bit more pronounced. I could go further. Had I wanted to, I could have taken some dead logs or other kinds of things and built up the pathway on either side so that I could more easily identify this pathway I was treading with my feet, or I could simply leave it alone. Leave it alone, and of course come the winter and come the snow, and no longer carting leaves to the pit because now the leaves have fallen and it'd be too cold to play outside. You can imagine by the springtime these pathways formed in the autumn would completely have disappeared. They might still remain had I bolstered them with these fallen logs, but even then they might go. And this is possibly a more accurate rendering of the insights, the research we now begin to develop about the brain, namely that these pathways are formed by experience, the way in which a path is laid down in the forest by people who walk or don't walk in a particular way. And there's nothing hardwired about any of that, because that pathway that I lay down in the forest is chosen by my feet. And I could choose a different one, and if I don't use it, far from being hardwired and remaining in place like a static circuit, it simply disappears. And this is now the picture we begin to develop about the nature of the brain. It is there when you use it, and if you don't use it, it simply becomes something else. That's a very new picture, understanding the nature of the brain. And will have implications for education I'll come to in just a moment. But now I want to go a bit further, because I want to focus on this business of bolstering the pathway, that is the logs or other things you can do to, in a certain sense, secure this channel that you've created. And this has to do with the myelin, because the myelin, once it begins to form around a particular neural pathway, helps to preserve it even if you don't use it constantly. Put it differently, the secret to brain development is myelinization. So, next question should be, well, how do I myelate my brain? Because if I want to have a good brain, that is lots of channels, lots of pathways, I better figure out how to have lots of myelin to secure these pathways, even if I don't use them so much. So again, we can turn to this question, how can we myelinate these pathways? And in talking about that now, Reggie Melrose, also others, have offered an interesting sort of shopping list, an interesting array of ways in which you can actually promote, cultivate, stimulate the production and the formation of myelin. Yes?
Is it not true, though, that the myelinization happens around the age, like before 11, and then after that, that's when the shedding occurs? And is this
That used to be the thought. This was the kind of old idea that you were kind of growing it and doing stuff until about, yes, this age pre-puberty, and then you're stuck with what you've done. And the good news is that that process continues. We can now say this because we have the capacity to investigate and track adults who go through brain trauma, be it surgery, be it tumors, other things, other reasons that allow you then to insert these different kinds of monitors and to discover that what we thought was over at the age of 10 or 12, as you say, actually can be continued. More subtly and of course with increasing difficulty, but nonetheless still possible well beyond the years that we thought was the case. So back to the question then, how do you myelate? Now, the first response to this question may not seem obvious, but remember that these pathways are being laid down by experience. So then we can kind of ask the question, well, are there experiences that stimulate the production of this myelin, especially then in the early years? To which the answer is yes, indeed. There is one thing above all that stimulates myelin production around these neural pathways in the early years. Strange to say, but that one thing is unstructured play. Mightn't be the obvious response, but unstructured play. In other words, play that the child, him or herself, shapes, as opposed to simply following out somebody else's agenda or playing a game that somebody else has arranged. No. This self-directed, self-structured, in that sense, unstructured play. This seems to have immense capacity in the stimulation of myelin. That's one. A second stimulant of myelin, which has now been recorded in a very expensive multi-million-dollar research project organized by the Dana Foundation, they have turned in not so much the kindergarten, but in the early elementary years, to a study of the myelinization of the brain through the practice of the arts. They've been able to establish now that there are certain arts in particular which, if practiced in especially grades 1, 2, 3, have direct connection in terms of advanced capacities in what we might call the cognitive sciences. So, for instance, music, dance, ballet by extension, certain kinds of painting even, can be shown to have impact on the higher cognitive functions of mathematics, for example, or even linguistic capacities, and the myelinization that goes with that as well. In this sense, we're looking not just at the physiological stimulants, but also the psychological advantages of the arts in terms of these higher brain cognitive functions. Again, you wouldn't normally expect the arts to have a relationship to the forming and the functioning of the brain, and yet now we begin to see that relationship as well. Yes?
It seems there's a lot of research coming out about older people getting into arts and how that's affecting them. So is that a similar effect then happening with them?
Yes. Yes. And of course, the impact is much greater the younger it starts. You can certainly start at an older age, but it sure helps to have had some earlier experience of it, because obviously if you practice an art earlier on, like riding a bicycle, you never quite forget that. And therefore, even if you let it go, and then come back as an old person to pick up a skill you had as a youngster, it's in a certain sense still there, and therefore can be more potent if it was practiced earlier on. Otherwise, it's less potent in its effect. All right, so we have play in the preschool years, we have the arts in the elementary years. There is one more set of experiments. This is more subtle and less decisive, having to do then with the role of stimulants of myelin in the high school. This is more speculative, and therefore I offer it with a bit more hesitancy, but nonetheless there is some potential or possible evidence to suggest that if in the high school the now not children but the students are engaged in a certain kind of disciplined imaginative practice, this also may assist in the more sophisticated development of the brain. Not a direct connection to myelinization there, but nonetheless an indirect connection showing that this imaginative discipline in high school can translate into a more sophisticated intellectual functioning later in adult life.
What are you referring to?
Pardon me?
Imaginative discipline. Give me an example,
Yes.
please.
Excellent question, because sometimes we think of imagination as doing daydreaming or fantasizing or all kinds of things. We talked about this in the high school meeting earlier today. Yeah, at least in terms of Waldorf education, one has to say that the disciplining of imagination as a faculty of knowing has to do with developing the capacity to see the world through the eyes of imagination in the following way. For instance, I'll give you just an easy example. In the, let's say, the 10th grade, this might work. I know a teacher who does this. You will introduce, let's say, into the classroom a leaf. And as often happens, you begin simply with a description and observation. No judgments, no theorizing here, just description. Describe the leaf, observe the leaf. Pay attention to certain aspects of it, the veins, and the base of the leaf, where all these veins come together in the kind of the stem of the leaf connecting to the tree, but basically descriptive. Step one. Step two, this might be a bit more abstraction, let's say more in mental pictures than in physical sense impressions. Step two, consider a river system, starting with its tributaries in the mountains, like here, and then gathering into rivulets and the rivers, and finally the great river and the delta going out to the sea. Step two. Step three, and now we're coming closer to imagination. Step three, set those two side by side, the leaf and its veins, the river system and the delta. And look then for some kind of relationship between the leaf and the river system. There's no causal relationship here, but you might detect a certain kind of functional relationship in the way that the leaf is organized, including the way in which it receives moisture, and the river system, how its moisture is organized. Step three. And if you want, don't have to force it, but it's a further step in this imaginative kind of discipline. Step four is to see, is there a gesture that is shared between the leaf and the river system? Do they share a kind of, do they share a gesture? This is not fantasizing, I'm not making it up. This is working with, in that sense, real physical phenomena, and yet you can see you're working more than just physically. You're working in a kind of disciplined, imaginative way to build relationships and to see relationships, and even to build analogies, which is another kind of imaginative activity, building analogies of one to the other. That's been one example of kind of disciplined approach to the imaginative work. And this, as you can appreciate, is as much to be practiced with the sciences as through, say, literature or the arts. So, that's another one. Now, just to finish out the story about how else you can myelinate your brain in a more down-to-earth way, there are two others that are mentioned in the disciplines or in the discussions now about brain research, beyond the ones I mentioned. And beyond that is the study of experiences in nature. You may know now we have studies to describe what is called nature deficit disorder. At a time, not maybe here, you're lucky to have it not here, but in other parts of the world where we are deprived of the kind of intimacy that you have here with nature. But imagine that you have times where you don't experience nature at all. You move essentially from a house to a vehicle to a school back to a vehicle to a house, and maybe never set foot on a piece of nature your whole day long. This can lead to a certain kind of deficit, which is called now nature deficit disorder. Interesting enough that there have been studies to show now that to the degree that a child is actively playing or being in nature, this does seem to stimulate the myelin production, especially in the elementary school years, compared to living without nature. And one last one, which goes right down into the physical organism, and that is the consumption of certain kinds of omega-3 fats. Salmon is apparently an excellent brain food, as they say, but more precisely, it's myelin food, or myelin-stimulating food that is in the salmon and other things with the omega-3 fats in them. So those are some quick ways to describe the way in which one can myelinate the brain, and notice that many of them have nothing to do with substance. They have to do with experience, rather than with things you might eat and digest. Okay, so much for that question about myelinating the brain. Now, I mentioned to you that if you have these pathways and you continue to use them, then the myelinization continues. If you don't use them, then this pruning happens. But frankly, even if you do use these pathways, partly because we have so many of them in childhood, some of them simply get pruned anyway. Not from abuse or lack of use, but simply because we have too many. I'll come back to this too many in just a moment. But before that, I want to show you a quick video of how this pruning happens and from where it starts. But before I show you this video, I have to be very clear about what you're about to see. You're not about to see a brain, although it looks like one. What you're about to see is the work of about 15 years in which researchers tracked the pruning of brains of 5-year-olds to approximately the age of 12 or 13, so from the elementary grades through the advent of puberty, more or less. And over that time, they collected all this data, then they crunched it in a machine and converted it into a kind of a graph. But it's a graph in the shape and form of a brain. So what you're seeing is not a brain going through changes. You're seeing 15 years of brains of all kinds of people, age 5 to 15, out of the data research then translated into a visual effect. So this is pure, in that sense, virtual. There's nothing real about this brain. It's simply a collection of data points rendered in the form of a brain. With that, let's see if I can get this to work. And with luck, I can show this to you, and if not, I won't. Is this going to work now, Vicky? Put you on the spot there. Okay.
It should. We turned it off, and it's. You need to just hit this button again to turn the light on. You need to open the window, let the light in. You got the lights, maybe? This is the full screen button. Okay, we need a little focus maybe.
Okay, this is good. Can you all see that? Might find a way from some of you. I'll try and stay out of the way if I have to get to that machine.
That's
Okay.
as good as it gets.
So this is a compilation of many people's brains as they were looked at the age of around 5 or so. The color coding is important to understand that the color coding, again, arbitrarily chosen, is to say that the young portions of the brain are rendered in red, to some degree also in yellow, and as the brain is going through this pruning process, it goes from this red condition or even yellow condition over the green to the blue. So the thing to watch out for is the blue in relationship to the red. Okay? I'll just run this very brief little, it's about 6-second video, and then we'll see what we can make of it. And so here we go. Over a period of about 7 years. Well, that was kind of quick, wasn't it? So let's go back, and I want to now see if I can run this in a different way, a bit slower. This time, see if you can watch how the blue overtakes the red, or more precisely from where the pruning happens first and where it finishes last. I'll run it quickly and then slowly. Yeah? So notice how from the top it then finally finishes out here. In other words, the neocortex, or the higher cortical functions, take a long time to complete this process of pruning.
This is the front.
And the front of the brain is here, that's right, yeah. Back of the brain, brain stem essentially down here, limbic system beneath, or above it rather, and then the neocortex, cortex. Notice that in this transition from red through yellow and green to blue, even purple, that does not change so much. That stays young, lifelong. This is your old brain, so to speak. This remains your young brain. That is to say, where the brainstem is, there's less pruning. Where there's neocortex, there's maximal pruning. And notice the pruning starts at the back and then wraps itself around to the front. I have to add as a parenthesis, since the choice of colors is arbitrary, at least in the country I come from, I would have to say that this particular graphic was developed by a Democrat. I'm not sure how colors work out here, but that's how it is in the United States. Okay, one last time, just to see that transition without any interruption, starting with the young brain and going then to the prepubescent brain. Now, can I have the lights back up again?
Did you want to keep that on?
No, that can now go up. Thank you. Okay. Now, there's another thing we have to talk about briefly here, and that is this question of pruning. See, normally you would imagine that you have nice, rich brains with lots of neural pathways, and you're the better for it. But, as I tried to suggest a few minutes ago, the healthy brain needs to go through this kind of pruning, or in a certain sense, even shrinking. What happens if this is not the case? There was an interesting study done looking at, I think it was the brains of 13 boys, and among those 13 boys, 7 were autistic. And they watched then these boys and the brains of these boys develop, and noticed that in the case of the autistic boys, their brains remained weightier longer. Weightier, heavier, longer. They did not go through the pruning. And specifically, it was interesting that the weight was about 16 or so % greater than the ones of the what you might call the typical boys. But more interesting was that in the so-called emotional centers of the brain, here the autistic boys had about 65% more of these neural pathways left. In other words, we think of more being better. But in this case, the boys who had more neural pathways in their emotional centers had this condition of autism, which has a lot to do with emotional disconnect. It's backwards of what you might expect. Rather than having more, in this case you have to say less is more. We have to go through this process of pruning in order to have a brain that is more accessible to our adult functioning. It defies kind of the usual laws of what we think to be the strength of an organ. Okay, so now, let's move on to the next part of all this. Because as we go to the next part, there's a little caution I have to add, but yes.
I would like to know, so clearly from experiences laying down the pathways, if you have the bad experiences, how do you work with that, not wanting to keep that or protect that?
Yes, the so-called bad experiences. You might imagine, to go back to my analogy of the walk in the woods, that if you were to have, and by bad, let's say strong, traumatic experience, this might be not just walking in the woods, but taking a shovel with you. And now you actually kind of dig into the soil. With the consequence that when the pruning time comes, it takes longer because more is needed to fill in, so to speak, this pathway if it's going to be pruned as part of your development. That's a way of saying, in other words, that these traumatic experiences are like neural pathways that became, shall we say, tarmacked. That is to say, a certain thing happened that is not so accessible to pruning or to development or to the natural changes of the body. It's like a scar, you might say. Yeah? And these pathways are no longer so much pathways as they are scarways, you might say.
And the myelin protects that as well, so it makes it even harder?
Yes, sometimes the myelin will, in a certain sense, desperately try to, hang on to these pathways in some cases. In other cases, it's not the case. And then the myelin will actually be removed. But there's a difference then between pathways that are scarred and pathways that are not. Because the pathway that is scarred is less likely to be dissolved. If you think about a scar, your skin changes, and skin will go. But the scar doesn't go away. The skin changes. Fresh cells, paradoxically. Same scar. So similarly with these traumatic experiences, they are laid down like scars, and even if myelin comes, myelin goes and comes, the scar is not quite so accessible to this transformation. And what causes those scars, we can come back to it in the last part. So, to move now to this next part of the evening here, with the word of caution. When we talk about biological events, it is very, very tempting to speak in terms of cause and effect. And therefore, with regard to these autistic children, it might be very tempting to say that because they have weightier brains, or because they have more neural pathways, therefore they are autistic. And that is not what the evidence suggests. What the evidence suggests is that the condition of autism may be accompanied by a weightier brain or a brain with more neural pathways. But that does not mean that that condition causes the autism. Just by the same token, we can say that if you have a cold, your cold may be accompanied by sneezing. But that doesn't mean that the sneeze causes your cold. It might cause somebody else's cold, but it doesn't cause your cold. Rather, the sneeze is an expression of, it accompanies, it goes with your colds. And as I mentioned to some of you earlier today, when we start talking about biological events as opposed to simply mechanical events in the physical world, once we move up, as it were, from mechanics to biology, that is, from the inert to the ert life, then the rules about causality change. And what is an effect and cause in the physical world may become very confusing in the biological world. This is why we have conundrums about chickens and eggs. Which is the cause and which is the effect? They can obviously flip very easily and still be credible as the other. So, as a way of saying, as I go into this next part, you almost have to bracket the concept of causality, at least as we apply to the physical world of rocks that go down mountainsides. We have to bracket that concept when we talk about the relationship between different aspects of the brain and different intellectual or emotional conditions. But with that proviso, I want to now move ahead to a comment that was made earlier this evening. about the nature of myelin and what might get in the way of it or what might threaten it. There is possibly one substance above all that is very threatening, shall we say, to myelin and the production of myelin. And that is another hormone, not the androgens, not the estrogens, but rather the hormone cortisol. That may be known to you. Cortisol, which not only attacks the myelin sheath, but also attacks other things as well. It attacks your bone mass and the calcium. It attacks the health of the muscle, the tension of the health of the muscle. It also tends to raise the blood pressure. In short, what the cortisol is, it's the condition or it's the hormone that makes you get older. It's the aging hormone, if you think of it in terms of its effects. And no exception then is its effect on myelin. To the degree that you are stimulating or releasing cortisol in your system, you are threatening or undermining the growth, or more precisely, the conditioned continuance of your myelin. Now, when do we have attacks of cortisol? Stress. Whenever there is stress, there is cortisol. Again, not cause and effect, but the when-then. When there is one, there is the other, and the other, there is the one. So, in moments of stress, we have cortisol. So when are we stressed? All kinds of conditions. There's one in particular which I find interesting. If you are, as I am, a recipient of emails, then you may have elected to associate a sound with the arrival of an email, or some little noise like that. And studies have now been done to show that whenever you get up in your life, a little bit of cortisol is released in your brain. Which is to say that every time an email comes, there's a little bit of this kind of stress, because it might be this, it might be that. And of course, stress is not negative. You might actually want to be stressed because you like to know what's going on in the world or what's going on in the neighbor's world. But nonetheless, the nature of this cortisol is that it is beginning to compromise your health of myelin. And there's one more element to this story, and that is, as you may know, that cortisol is by its nature addictive. That is to say, the more that is released in your system, the more you are prone to seek circumstances or events that release it. By virtue of being addictive, this is not something you're necessarily aware of. Addiction often comes from behind and catches you by surprise. So likewise here, the degree to which you find yourself in stressful conditions or conditions that are stimulating or releasing of cortisol, you may be surprised to find that you want more of them. That is to say, at some level, you actually welcome a deluge of emails, even though on the surface you may be frustrated by that inundation. You still go back. You don't change the computer settings. You don't change the sound. You don't discontinue your account. You allow these emails to flood over you, but they have their price. And what is true then of emails, you can now multiply through any number of these kinds of stimulants or events or things that happen in your life that generate this kind of little surge, this little drip, you might say, of cortisol into your system. And remember that like any hormone, it doesn't take much for a hormone to be immensely, powerfully effective in your physical body. Okay, so that's quickly a word about the development of myelin, what promotes it and what does not. To sum up this sort of part where we are here, I would like to suggest to you that if you look at the research into the brain, in terms of the structure of it, yes, very, very hierarchical and even predictable. That is to say, the brainstem will grow before the limbic, and the limbic will grow before the cortical hemispheres are completed. In that sense, very hierarchical. But if we switch from the function, from the structure of the brain to the functioning of the brain, it is not hierarchical at all. It is highly susceptible to circumstance, to experience, to environment, to, yes, hormones that are stimulated by your day-to-day life. In that sense, the brain, from the functional aspect, is not hierarchical. It is, now comes a fancy word, it is exemplastic. Exemplastic, I love that word because nobody understands what it means. And because anybody know what it means? Good. Because if nobody knows what it means, then I can use it in a way that is precise to my meaning. I owe this word to the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who in his theory of imagination, by the way, describes then this imagination as the esemplastic power. What is the esemplastic power? Or in this case, the esemplastic working of the brain. This is the way of working that is ultimately, perfectly, completely malleable. That is to say, the direct opposite of hardwired. It is the most flexible, the most fluid, the least structured, the least hierarchical. That's what's meant by esemplastic, superplasticity, supermalleability. The brain in its functioning is esemplastic, even if it is structured hierarchically in its growth. There was one interesting study that shows this a little bit. There was a study done on London taxi drivers. Now you may know that if you're a London taxi driver, you have to go through a very, very rigorous training to learn every single alley and mews and back roads of London by heart, or more precisely by brain. You may not use the GPS, you certainly are not allowed to use any maps. You have to know every single channel, every single route in London so that you can be an effective taxi driver and get your passengers to the place they need to get to most quickly, most efficiently. So, a study was done with these taxi drivers, and they measured then these taxi drivers' hippocampus, which I mentioned earlier has something to do with memory, right? Remember the estrogens? So, in this capacity here, towards the back here, there's this tiny little part of the brain which seems to have something to do with capacity to memorize things or remember things, specifically maps. So these taxi drivers had their hippocampus measured before they entered into the regime of becoming a taxi driver, and then they were measured again after they passed the test and become legitimate London taxi drivers. And wouldn't you know it, that their hippocampus had actually swollen a little bit. It's actually grown as adults now, not as children, as adults. These areas of the brain have actually been developed to the point of growing a bit larger, directly connected with their training. The brain is that flexible that if you engage in a certain kind of behavior, a certain kind of discipline, this can be reflected in the relative changing shapes and forms and structures of the brain itself. Yes?
So how is that so different than if I was, consistently working out and my muscle changed?
In a certain sense, it's not. But notice, now we're beginning to describe the brain more again to the muscular system than to a system that we used to associate with electricity and wires and things that don't change. And it doesn't matter how often you turn the switch on and off, the wire is not going to get fatter. If anything, less. But basically, that's the good news about electric wiring. That unless you're really abusive or have a lot of water in your house, these wires can go on for decades. Used or not used, they're simply there. You go away for 6 months, some of these people do in Whistler, they go away for half a year, come back, turn the lights on, and hey presto, the house is no different from what it was 6 months ago. In that sense, the electrical system, very stable and not dependent upon use. How different the muscle system. As you're saying yourself, don't use the muscles, go as an astronaut into space and don't use them, you know what happens. In that sense, the muscle has continuously to be used to be effective. Now we're beginning to say that, yeah, there are aspects of the brain that are more like the muscular system than like the wiring of the electrical nervous system. Yeah? And that's a very radical shift if you follow out the implications of that. Because what it means is that education needs to be much more in movement than we may think it needs to be. And that gets closer to the last part of this evening. Something back there? No, okay. So let's move ahead to the last part of what I'd like to bring this evening here. Because you see, if we think of this brain as esemplastic, this, you see, flies in the face of the old ideas of the brain as being a formed, fixed structure. We have to think of the brain in different ways here because of what the evidence tells us. Now, to put it differently, it used to be said that the brain is development was essentially 80% a matter of genetics, that is to say, determined by birth, and maybe 20% accessible or vulnerable to influences of the environment. Today, those numbers have been flipped, and brain researchers are willing to say that the brain is approximately 80% formed according to environmental circumstances, diet being one, experience being another one, stress being one, and so forth. These are all environmental examples. And maybe 20% still have a genetic base. But even that 20% now is in question. Because if you know anything about genetics, you may know there's a new perspective being introduced to the study of genetics called epigenetics that introduces the radical idea that one's genetic disposition can also be influenced by direct environmental circumstances. So that even the most resistant part of ourselves, which we attribute to genetics, it also seems to be now also amenable to the circumstances of changing fluid environmental experiences. So, yes.
Just to clarify, is that DNA changing over time due to ancestral experience, or are you
No,
suggesting
the
that?
interesting thing about epigenetics says that it kind of undercuts the fundamental assumption of classical genetics by saying that in the case of this epigenetic study, the genetic disposition can change within a single generation. It used to be thought that maybe over many generations there might be some subtle... No, this is saying within one generation there can be an observed change in the genetic
But previous
constitution.
to my parents, for example.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
So that, in that sense, yours can already be different from your parents, as opposed to having to wait for your grandchildren to make up the difference. Back there was a someone? Yes.
Yeah, 'cause my understanding of genetics is that we can have the trait, but environment will influence if the trait turns on or off.
They have
And
a
then it will get weakened through generations without use.
they have a response to that in Austria,
Okay?
and the response to a statement like that is Jein. Ja und ja. In other words, I'll put it this way, there's a kind of rearguard action to try and hang on to some of the classical understandings of genetics, and that's the way they do it. And say, well, it's basically there, it just doesn't pop up. Yeah? The evidence is kind of missing because it's hypothetical, but nonetheless, that's the way of the theory tries to hang on to some legitimacy for the determinacy of the genetic model. But what's interesting is that the more we pursue the evidence, the less that becomes an adequate, it's not wrong, but it's less adequate as an explanation. There are just too many other things going on for that to become still a credible way of explaining phenomena. Yes?
So the term sort of neuroplasticity, which you seem to hear a lot about, that is the same as or
Yes.
different than
Correct. So it's interesting you raise that, you see, because if I had given this talk maybe 10 years ago, that word would not be in the room. This is a recent term, and briefly the history of that term is interesting, because there was, I think back in the 1990s, one, maybe two, certainly one researcher who decided to pursue this idea, namely the idea that the brain is, in my language, exemplastic. He wrote a paper in which he used not my word, but a very similar word, your word, neuroplasticity, in the title of his research. Because the word was in the title, the paper was not even read by the peers, because this word neuroplasticity was so heretical in terms of the classical understanding of the brain that anybody saying that couldn't be right. So far as being assessed, he was simply rejected at the front door. He continued, by the way, to do his work and continue to be rejected and ignored, as often happens with genius, until then other people began to recognize that there was something to this, what we now call fully matured brain. And what's the difference? The difference is that in a fully matured brain, there's coherence and communication. And in the incomplete, shall we say, or immature brain, a part of the brain can be doing one thing with another part of the brain having no idea what's going on, called the teenager. Yeah? You say to them, why'd you do that? And they say, well, I don't know. Exceptions in the room here, but generally speaking, yeah. And not to blame it on the brain, but to say that, again, not when then, not cause and effect, but to say that in the case of the teenage brain, these fibers of the corpus callosum are still in the process of finishing their development and differentiation. And only when that has happened, and we're talking 23, 24, when that in a certain sense, I would say, finishes, becomes to a certain level of completion, can we say we've now got the fully coherent brain of a supposedly functioning adult. So that's what has yet to happen in the last part. But still, since you made the transition into the last part, I want to move to this third question, not about the structure of the brain or the function of the brain, not how it grows or how it develops, but now what are the implications for education in the light of this research? Yes?
The age is the same for males and females, the 22, 23, or is it?
Approximately, yes. The one difference is that, and again, the evidence is a little tentative here, because you can appreciate this is hard to do, hard to measure, and you need lots of examples. But the evidence suggests a little bit that this fiber building of the corpus callosum seems to be a little bit more profuse in women than in men. Maybe. So it happens at about the same time, but in the case of the females, more so. Maybe. Okay. Yeah? All right, so let's go then to the final part. This has to do then with the implications of this work, because perhaps you can already appreciate that the degree to which we recognize the brain as being this very malleable, as in plastic organ, this really has to turn education on its head. And why is this? Well, as I mentioned earlier to the faculty today, if you think about much of educational theory, much of it, not all of it, but much of it, it rests on the idea that there is somebody who knows something and a bunch of people who don't. And the one who knows something is therefore instructed to tell the others what he knows or she knows, so that these people can know it. These are called students, this is called teacher. And the assumption therefore is that this person called the teacher will take what he or she knows and inserts it or delivers it into the empty spaces of the students, who have receptacles ready-made and fixed in order to capture what is being presented in such a way that they can hang on to it without changing it. And the way they prove that they've got it and haven't changed it is they get tested. And the test establishes whether the delivery was successful and retained. That's a kind of cute, quick, but nonetheless maybe recognizable way of describing much of educational assumptions. But that, you see, doesn't work if the brain is now seen to be an utterly fluid, flexible, malleable, changeable organ. There are no set vessels, there are no circuits, there are no places, there are no shoeboxes, there are no pages upon which you can impress something in such a way that it stays and sticks and doesn't change. We need, in other words, a different education model, because the brain model is changing for us. So the question is, what other models of education do we have that maybe approximate these new models or these new images, these new analogies that we're developing for the brain? At a minimum, one has to say, we're looking for an education that is not transmission of stuff from here, insertion there, and retention over there. That is no longer an adequate picture of what education is. We need something else. So what is it that we need? Well, the opposite in a way is one way to begin. Rather than imagining education as a process of delivery of material retained, instead of that, I would offer a different model of education, where the task is not insertion, but rather the task is to develop precisely these organs of cognition in such a way that they retain their maximum flexibility. Because if these organs retain their flexibility, then they will be most successful in working in the environment that now the brain researchers tell us is the way it works. You see the difference? Because if you see that difference, you can begin to understand something of the radical shift that's needed now in our educational theory, and frankly, more precisely, in the educational practice. We're looking for ways of developing capacities in human beings that preserve their maximum flexibility, organic, but also maybe psychological as well. And what might that look like? What might a education look like that is built on maximum flexibility?
Messy. Would look messy.
Messy. It'll look messy and noisy and a bit hard to choreograph and certainly difficult to put on a calendar and say today you do this and tomorrow you do that. It will require a very different notion about how this process of learning is to proceed. I'd like to offer then some possible ways to think about this. And I want to look at this question of flexibility not only at the obvious level of the physical organism, but I want to look at it also in other aspects of psychological development as well, and maybe even something about the nature of spirit. But let's start with the flexibility of the physical body. We need an education that promotes the maximum flexibility of the body. And what is the education that does that? I mentioned already earlier, it is an education that's based upon play, or precisely unstructured play. That kind of education, especially in the early years, helps build the kind of brain that needs the kind of, or that provides the kind of flexibility that you need in later life. There was an interesting study, to digress for a second, done by two professors at Harvard. One was a neuroscientist, the other one was a specialist in child development. They're married. They had the advantage of living in the dorms, and therefore had a chance to observe the undergraduates working their way through the years of Harvard. And as scientists, of course, they were observant and they were watching, and they noticed that these undergraduates in their dorm fell into sort of two groups. The one group, managed to get on with business and did the assignments and met the deadlines and stayed fairly healthy and graduated inside 6 years. It takes a while at Harvard. But the other group constantly kept running up against obstacles of illness and missing deadlines and dropping out and taking a gap year every year and maybe not graduating at all. And being scientists, they wanted to find out, was there anything between these two groups that might account for this difference? And they tried different variables, diet, socioeconomic backgrounds, nothing seemed to generate much difference until they came across the following. Through, again, surveys, they established that this first group, that is the group that made it through Harvard in 6 years successfully, this first group had, in a larger percentage, had in their kindergarten a play-based curriculum. And the second group, which didn't make it so easily through Harvard, had been through a kindergarten experience that was more what you might call a skill-based curriculum, early reading, that kind of thing. And so they wrote a paper, these two scientists, and the conclusion they wrote was, if you want to go to Harvard, play. That is the best way to prepare yourself to enter into this advanced academic kind of life. And that makes sense to me if you think in terms of play as the vehicle at the physical level for developing the most flexible, malleable, functioning organ up here for later higher cognitive work in university. Yes?
I'm wondering if there's evidence of brain flexibility correlating with academic success, psychological success, and if so, what's the measure of brain flexibility?
Yes, it's sometimes called the creativity quotient. That is to say, if you can, and you can test this out, it's often done with visual effects. You show people a bunch of visual things and you see how inventive can they be to make use of things in the unpredictable way. That's one way of kind of measuring this sort of flexible thinking, that you think of a nail as something other than a thing that holds things together, or you think of a tray as something other than something that holds something else. And in this way you can measure pretty easily this kind of malleable way of manipulating or using circumstances of your environment. And that's one way of kind of quickly testing the level of creativity that you may or may not have. That's one way to do it. Another way, which is more scary, is if you work with flight simulators, if you're becoming an airline pilot. And if you become an airline pilot, you may know there are certain things you learn to do. And one case I can think of was not so much a simulation but a real situation. But this pilot had been through the simulator, so he knew what you do if this happens with wind or this happens with sandstorm and so on. And the training is to say that if you hit a sandstorm, then you pull up to get over the sandstorm. And so there were two pilots who were coming in to land in Cairo or somewhere in Africa, and they hit such a sandstorm, and instinctively, intuitively, they went down. And in pulling down, what happened was the sand went through the turbines and they were saved. And had they pulled up, the sand would have been trapped in the turbines and the turbines would have stopped and the plane would have crashed. Here's an example where flexible thinking, in a certain sense, had to be active and all the training you had, and all the rules you had, and all the things you normally do had to be thrown out the window in the moment. That's maybe a real life test of how flexible, how can you be creative in the moment as opposed to simply following the rules of your training. And that also you can do in a simulator, not just in the real life situation. You can test people out to see how flexible they can be in certain predetermined kinds of scenarios. Does that make sense for the moment?
Yeah, and then the first one, is there like evidence that brain flexibility correlates with academic success and psychological success?
Yes, yes. That has to do then with this survey I mentioned earlier by the Dana Foundation, describing then how these very basic experiences later translate into this higher functioning creativity. Yeah. So to finish out then the evening here, this flexibility on the one hand at the physical level I suggested can be most promoted by a curriculum that's based on play. But I'd like to take this question of flexibility another level up. I'd like to move from the physical body and flexibility at the physical body and put a similar question at the level of the psychological life, that is to say, at the level of the soul. Can we also speak about flexibility in terms of the soul life? I would say we can, but it has a slightly different language. What is flexibility at the level of the soul? That we might call, let's call it creativity. That is the ability to be flexible in terms of, emotional conditions or emotional descriptions or other kinds of ways of working the life of emotions. And here, of course, the role of the arts returns, because the degree to which you have a curriculum based on the arts, this is educating flexibility of the soul. Expression, poetic, musical, sculptural, it doesn't matter what the art is. Wherever you have a discipline in the arts, you're making possible at the soul level a certain kind of creative flexibility that otherwise you wouldn't have. So for me, the role of the arts in terms of developing flexibility, not just at the physical, but at the soul level, is as important in the elementary years as play is in the kindergarten years. And that finally leaves one level more, because we are not only beings of physical disposition, we are not only beings of psychological or soul conditions. As human beings, especially as individual human beings, we have something else. And whatever that else is, you can call it by different languages, but it's that which gives you a sense of who you are and a certain sense of what you do in terms of your spiritual life, not just your psychological life. And whatever you call that, there also I'd like to ask the question, can we imagine developing a certain kind of flexibility at that level as well? But that also deserves different language. That is not just a matter of being flexible or even being creative. Now flexibility elevated to the level of the spirit, I would say, that is expressed in terms of freedom. For me, freedom is flexibility at the spiritual level, or if you like, you can think of flexibility being freedom at the physical level. They are related there. So how can we imagine an education that not only cultivates physical flexibility and emotional creativity, but also works at this third level of flexibility, that is to say, developing genuine human freedom? And here I think there is something to be said for what happens in the high schools. For example, in Waldorf schools, just like in Waldorf preschools they play, and in Waldorf elementary schools they do the arts. They continue into the high school to be sure. But there is something else, I think, which can happen in the Waldorf high school, frankly, any high school, to the degree that this flexibility is exercised at this third level. And how might that be? Just one example. If you think about different ways of studying science, frankly, a lot of study of science has to do with being told a theory and then testing it in the lab or the worksheet or in some kind of experiment. You're handed something and you simply confirm it. There's no freedom in that. It's right, but it's not free. But imagine reversing that process. Start not with the theory, which already determines the answer or determines the interpretation of the answer, but start with the phenomena. Start with the stuff, the event, the circumstances, the messy muddle. And out of that set of phenomena, begin to try and discern or discover some kind of insight or theory or law. Notice how that's different. Sure, the law may be the same, but the way you arrive at it is not through predetermined supposition, but through a genuine intellectual, cognitive, sometimes highly abstract process of discovery, which is yours and therefore free to learn. The difference, therefore, between learning what other people have decided for you and discovering it, even if it's the same thing, is the difference then between inflexibility and flexibility at the level of the spirit, or in this case, abstract intellection. So at these three levels, be they physical or psychological or even spiritual, one can, I think, introduce a kind of education that cultivates this kind of flexibility, both physical and metaphysical, that makes it possible to be a free and active human being in the world. And that brings me perhaps to the very last thing for the evening, because wherever you have flexibility, there's something else that you can expect as well. To the degree that people begin to exercise this kind of inner flexibility, it becomes possible to begin to think and to understand the world in terms of pictures, because pictures also come out of this creative, flexible, free kind of way. I can say what I like, but I cannot force you to picture what I'm saying. You will have your own images of what I say, if you have any images at all. To the degree I'm successful, the images may make sense to you, but they still will be your images. And if one had the opportunity and frankly the time, one could go through the whole room and then hear the huge range of variety of images, analogies, pictures that each person can create out of his or her own thinking. To the degree, therefore, that we think in pictures, a new kind of thinking becomes possible. Because the moment you start thinking in pictures, by the very nature of pictures, you start thinking in terms of wholenesses. Pictures always come in wholes. There's never a part. It's always, even if it's partial, it's always as a whole. And you can spend then all the time you want going through the different aspects of the picture, but the picture retains its wholeness. The significance of that is that the degree to which we think in pictures, and therefore think in wholes, we are thinking in health. Because wherever there is wholeness, there health will follow. Much of illness is incompletion or not wholeness. But the degree to which we're able to think, and then by thinking live, in these wholes, we are living in a condition of health. For me, in times which are fragmented, in times that are somewhat atomized, in times that can be very, very much in parts, or as the poet T.S. Eliot calls it, broken images, a heap of broken images, his depiction of modern times. In a time like that, we need children who can think in pictures, because by thinking in pictures, they think in wholenesses. And in thinking in wholenesses, they bring us health. When there is health, obviously then in the wholeness, the ultimate wholeness involves not only the complete picture of their environment, but their place in that environment, because their place is part of the whole picture in which they stand. So rather than imagining a generation of people who feel increasingly distantiated or separated from their circumstances, finding no meaning or purpose in what they do, here we're trying to develop a kind of thinking, a kind of being in the world that works with whole pictures, because in the whole picture you find your own place in the circumstances and the circumference of your vision. So we hope for that kind of growth. Yes, to build flexible organs, yes, to build creative souls, but maybe above all, to develop this kind of freedom in our thinking, because out of that freedom and wholeness can come healing for the generations that are yet to follow. I will stop here, and we can do one of three things. We can go home. We can break the set for those who need to go home. And then thirdly, for those who have further comments or questions, I'm certainly willing to stay a bit longer. But I recognize that you should have, especially if you have teenagers at home, you should have the opportunity to go and check in on them. And therefore, I suggest we break here. I thank you very much for coming. There are remaining things maybe on the table there if you want still to sample what I do elsewhere. But if you have further questions, maybe in about 90 seconds or so, we can reassemble closer to the hand, and then we can have further conversation if you're interested. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming this evening. Have a wonderful year.